Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Koehrer, Managing Director at Bank of America. And with me on the panel, George Kurian from NetApp, Mahdi from Radiant, Aaron Ginn from Hydra Host, Ben from Polarise, and Max from Coatue. So it's pretty clear that we are going through what one could recognize in one of the most fundamental transformational technological shift the human race ever experienced. And as we're going through this shift, it's increasingly recognized that the implications go far beyond technology and affect everything we do, and in particular, relationships between states. We've seen in the recent past, basically government curtailing access to frontier models. We've seen government taking proactive policies in order to reduce their dependencies on other countries when it comes to AI. And so what is sovereign AI? What does this entail? And how does it affect the stack? This is basically the purpose of today's panel. First question, and we had quite a bit of a debate with my panelists on this topic in preparation of today. I'll ask first each of them to give their definition or their understanding of what is sovereign AI. And maybe, George, I ask you to start on this.
Thank you. My view of sovereign AI is that it is a result of both the geopolitical landscape as well as people's recognition of, or government's recognition of the importance of AI. I think it is ultimately the need for either a national government, a nation state, or an organization to be able to independently control the development, the deployment, and the governance of their AI-related activities. And that could include technology, various elements of the technology stack. It could include data. It could include operations. It could include talent. I think that's sort of the quick summary.
Mahdi, you want to comment?
Yeah, I think the key thing with sovereign AI, the way we see it, is that it's not really, it's not an end state, right? It's a continuous spectrum, and different organizations or nations will take decisions in terms of how much control they want to take of the different components of AI in general, and how much do they want to de-risk as they go through that process. So it's a continuous spectrum in that regard, I think. And as AI develops, that spectrum is constantly developing as well. But the key point of it is around control and putting controls in there.
Aaron?
I would probably start with data residency. I think that that's going to become an increasing, very durable trend, mostly because the technology shift that happened with GPUs is fundamentally anti-cloud. And so now you actually have the ability to do it, so you will do it. So I would probably not focus too much on the model layer or even like AI native layer, like companies in that zone. Probably focus on like the actual data center infrastructure, the chips, data residency, things that reflect actually into national identity, because those are like the precursors to the AI native ecosystem, and like within those countries. So I would say like chips, data, money, kind of staying in the country, as opposed to like, Amazon renting a data center space in Luxembourg and the money going back to Amazon. I would say it's much more about developing that the fundamentals around the ecosystem that in that country, and then from there you start seeing more of something specific to whatever kind of expression they want to put into AI that reflects their nation state.
So we'll pick up on, obviously you started going into my second question, so we'll definitely come back on that. Ben, can I ask you from your point of view?
Yeah, sure. Maybe from a European perspective especially, I think the Europeans are catching up now, getting the importance of the AI workloads, right? So somehow, especially from Germany, we are a little bit in a recession. So the workforce is getting older and older, so we need to watch out that we're not losing the train when it comes to AI. So what I'm heading to is that AI is, in the end, a kind of critical infrastructure, especially for Europe nowadays and the next years. And that we should see it as such, right? So the token production, so the underlying utility in the end. So I see the tokens as a utility. And it's same like gas, electricity, water, and being dependent on the production of your utilities is a key or should be a key. Right now, we are heavily dependent on hyperscaler infrastructure. So coming back to Aaron, I see the same, that it's also the physical infrastructure that needs to be sovereign in the end and not run on hyperscalers. Or, I mean, we won't avoid that, but that we should come up with alternatives for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Max, to you then.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these gentlemen said exactly how I had thought about it up until maybe 2 weeks ago, and the only difference is there's maybe now another layer, like we're speaking at the nation state sort of macro layer of where things are located, where it's hosted. The new one, which in panel discussions over the last 2 days, I feel like has come up a lot more, is sovereignty as sort of data sovereignty, and do you as a company own your data, not necessarily do you as a nation own your AI infrastructure. So it's just another angle that I think seems to come up more and more. Are you using open models? Do you own those models? Do you own the weights, or are you not? And where is your data going / who owns it is another angle of sovereignty, which as a tech investor I find to be interesting.
Perfect. So I agree it kind of informs the next question, because you, and Aaron, you started alluding to this, right? Which is that one could take the views that are part of the stacks, which are much more critical than others in order to achieve, sovereign AI to the extent it is achievable. And if you look from, all the way down to the chip layer, all the way up to the application layer, I'm sure that each of you will have potentially different views as to, what is more critical in terms of reaching this level of independence and therefore sovereign AI. And so maybe, Mahdi, I'll ask you to start with that, and then I'll ask some of you to add to this.
This is a very long debate, man.
Here we go.
Look, I mean, for me, I always think about it from a control plane perspective. And regardless of where the physical infrastructure is located, regardless of what you're running on top of that control plane, as long as you have sovereignty over that control plane that is managing everything that is above it and below it, I think that's the most critical part in the sovereign AI stack for any organization, for any government or nation doing that.
Okay. Maybe on this very topic, can I ask you, Ben, to comment as well?
Yeah, as said previously, so being in charge of the infrastructure. So, I mean, what we do at Polarise is trying to think it end-to-end for our customers. So from owning the real estate, owning the infrastructure for it, owning the GPUs, I don't know, a Kubernetes layer on top of it. And what we're also building is a Polarise Drive where we're hosting open source models. So, of course, we could have a debate in each of these layers of how sovereign and independent we could be. But starting maybe with the infrastructure and being maybe not dependent from a European perspective as well, not dependent on hyperscalers, owning and running that is really a critical thing, I think, because the US Cloud Act may claw everything in the end. So we are not fully secure of that.
Okay, maybe Max, I ask you to add to this, and just to add to this debate, right, which is that depending on, indeed, there are potentially parts of the stack which are more important than others, but maybe if you want to integrate to the answer an element of how achievable it is when you know the level of complexity of the supply chain, right? And so even if we were to agree on this panel, there are some parts actually which are much more important than others. Actually, is it just achievable knowing that, just if you look at chip manufacturing, the complexity of the supply chain is such that, how independent can you really be?
Yeah, I mean, it has, I think, governments have seen it as an evolution of trying to figure out what sovereign AI actually means. Clearly, chip export controls were part of that equation. Now there's discussion of what companies are benefiting from what models. Are American companies benefiting from Chinese open source models more than the Chinese companies that created those models are, is a question. The actual location of the data centers, who built the data centers is a question. Then I think where I had spent a lot of time and continue to find to be an interesting question is like, we talk about all of the bottlenecks in building out AI infrastructure, power and energy being one of them. Just to take one example of gas turbines, which is a type of equipment that a lot of people use to build power plants in the US and abroad. There's 3 major suppliers, and one of them is American, 2 are not. And a lot of that power is being shipped to American data centers. And I don't know, it's an interesting question. We're talking so much about chips. We're not talking about where is American equipment allowed to go and where is European, German equipment or Japanese equipment allowed to go, because right now a lot of it is coming to the US still.
Maybe George, if you can add on this, and maybe as well from a NetApp perspective, on this point of the part of the stack and how maybe with the current stack, what you offer to your customers allows to deliver an element of sovereignty.
What we work on with clients is the ability to give them complete control of their data. I think you mentioned, Aaron, that data becomes one of the durable moats in the industry. And I think that that's our contribution. It's giving you the ability to control it and deploy it wherever you want. If you feel like you want to deploy it in a hyperscaler, you can. You want to deploy it in a sovereign environment, you can. If you want to keep full control in your own data center, you can. And it's a choice, right? I think that what I find interesting is that the controls that the US government, for example, has put on certain parts of the technology stack has actually spurred innovation, right? It's caused the Chinese to work on diffusion-based models. It has caused people to innovate around those constraints, and I think that that's actually a useful thing. I think that relying on one source of every technology in the stack is not a good thing overall for just progress and innovation in the industry. Not that those large hyperscalers who we work with are not spending a lot of money and doing good innovation, but I think competition's a good thing. And if sovereignty encourages competition, innovation, great, that's a good thing.
And maybe to finish on this topic, Aaron, if I can ask you to comment and maybe just to explain from your point of view in terms of what Hydra Host offers, to which extent the solution also helps achieve this goal of sovereign AI.
Yeah, so we have a number of sovereign clients and as election governments that either their telco arm, their energy company, or some part of they sometimes create a new agency. And so we provide the OS at the data center level so that they don't have to have any expertise in running NVIDIA gear, and also allows off-takers a standard way of accessing deployments in far-flung places that they have no interest in coloing or didn't even know existed. But you'll take a GPU from El Salvador, you'll take a GPU from Panama because you're like, why not? It's a GPU. So I think that the way that people view sovereignty is like, one is like there's in economic speak that there's the opposite effect of the public commons tragedy fallacy, which is that like once you kind of break the shell of like someone who doesn't want to participate, it kind of like unravels kind of quickly. And so obviously the positive effect of that is the like idea of like the environment of like that's why we have to have laws of that, but also like goes the other way. And so in some respects we have to admit that like China won the internet battle because one is that Americans have to realize that I'm an American, and I'm also Chinese, so that much of what we consider today free markets or like platforms that people build on is actually American goods being exported, and we don't view it that way. We sort of like for example, the open oceans, right? So all of the laws that regulate the way we do free trade, it's because we have 11 different Navy fleets that sail around the world and says that this is open. So we deploy someone in the Strait of Malta, we deploy in the Mediterranean, we deploy in the Gulf region, because we say this is open, right? So that there's not like this kind of secular free trade thing of like, we just all agree. It's like, no, that's actually not how this works, right? And I think that what the Europeans have realized over the course of several administrations, the most commonly accepted one is around NATO, that the Europeans just outside of the polls, like they just kind of been not doing anything, and so now they realize that like, oh crap, we gotta do something, right? And I think that that's good for the world, because it reestablishes like the what he was just saying about like local economies being able to like develop. And I also don't think this is the end of free trade. I think it's an iteration of like, it's almost like kind of a reestablishment back to what it was in like the 50s and kind of pre-World War II stuff. And so I think it's like a healthier balance of that nation states should be able to express themselves in their own local phenotypes and how they want to trade with the world. Yeah. But fundamentally the world all doesn't have to be the same. And I think it took American policy to kind of get there. And I think they're doing it in ways that are helpful and doing it in ways that are not helpful. But I think everyone in this conference has to realize that GPUs are regulated in the US government as if it is a missile defense technology. Is it a missile? Can I put it on an F-35 jet and sell it to Germany and you can shoot it at somebody? No, right? But that's where it is. And once the governments decide that something is regulated that way, it generally doesn't go the other way. Yeah. So like governments have will that is exogenous to markets. It's a free agent actor in the market that is completely removed from market forces. And so the current posture of not just US government, but Chinese government, the European governments, that this is a regulated technology, that fastest ever in the history of probably Silicon Valley. And it's just something that everyone in this conference has to accept, that like there's a third player in this go-to-market. And when does the government ever relinquish control of anything? So it's just something we all have to, admit that it's going to be a durable trend.
Thank you. So next topic, and I introduced the concept of the part of the stack which are potentially more, critical to this sovereignty element than others. Obviously, one question, that everyone has in mind is the role of hyperscalers in that sovereignty element, and knowing that not every nation or economic bloc, has a proper hyperscaler. So the question is really, in simple terms, can nations achieve sovereign AI, while using existing hyperscalers? And so maybe here, obviously, we have, very different point of view. But there is a concept behind this which was discussed during our prep sessions, which I'll ask Max to comment first, because this, very interesting concept around rerouting, which I'd love you, Max, to start with, and then we'll obviously go to Mahdi as well as Ben, and finish with George, if you're okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, these guys will be able to speak maybe more intelligently to it, but for me as an investor looking from the outside, I realized as I was thinking about this question, there are already products that exist, like an Amazon Bedrock or a Microsoft Foundry or Google Vertex or Base 10 or Fireworks, or a lot of these businesses that are routing your model requests to specific models. And so you may not, whether you're directing exactly where that goes or whether you've built an agent that directs based on best possible use case, this is, I guess, if we're starting from the dirt at the bottom all the way to the ethereal model layer at the top, I think this is as far up as you can go to think about, hey, what model is my data actually getting sent to, and who created that model? That was a question I had thought about. I think model routing has become a much, much, much bigger topic of discussion in the last 6, 9, 12 months, and it's a lot of what people have been talking about on this stage. And I think that plays into the sovereignty question, as I talked about in the beginning. So I don't necessarily know the answer on it, but it, again, complicates at what layer are you able to designate where things are. And George, I think this business helps to solve that problem, but it is one that people are now just starting to deal with and think about. Yeah.
Okay. So knowing that and being conscious of those issues, I mean, what does this mean? And maybe Ben and Mahdi, I ask you to come first in terms of, this point of, is there a way to actually, deliver properly sovereign solutions, knowing in particular that context, or do you have to basically go through a completely independent, infrastructure?
So I think it's the second, having the completely independent infrastructure. So looking at use cases from the past, I know that there are products from AWS or Microsoft or Google saying it's the sovereign package or whatsoever.
Yeah.
But you had, when was it? Last year, was it, I think, Microsoft France, the General Counsel in front of the French Senate, stating under oath that he cannot assure that the data stays with France. Or you have the Amsterdam Trade Bank blocking on the Google Cloud last year. You have OVH Cloud still being in a lawsuit with Canada regarding French data because they have a Canadian subsidiary. So I think in order to avoid that, there's only that one way from our perspective, and so a clear no on the basic question. Yeah.
Mahdi?
Yeah, I think it goes back to how much control and how much de-risking do you want to do in achieving or working towards sovereignty. And if you believe that I need to control the infrastructure, then you can't achieve that on the hyperscalers. But then there's other camps that say, well, hyperscalers build data centers in your country.
Yeah.
So that's physical infrastructure in your country, if that's how you're defining that. But then they control the control plane for that, and that's where they. So again, it goes back to especially governments today. I mean, I see in sovereign AI they go through 3 phases. There's rhetoric, then there's policy, and then there's execution. I don't think we got to the execution phase yet in any of the different governments. I mean, maybe some of them have moved towards policy at the moment, especially around Europe, different places. And that shift from policy to execution is where a lot of the decisions need to be made. And again, the decision, I think, should be very simple. It's around control and how much de-risking do you want to do for the future. Because if you have less control over a certain thing, whether it's the data or the infrastructure or the control plane or even the models you're using, then you're giving sovereignty away to somebody else, potentially. Yeah. Right? And that's the spectrum that I think a lot of countries and even companies, I mean, sovereignty, it's associated to nations, but it is something that large organizations and enterprises should be thinking about as well. So wherever they sit on that spectrum, that's where decisions get made in terms of the infrastructure, hyperscalers, and so on, I think.
So maybe to conclude on this topic, George, from your point of view, the ability to deliver an element of sovereignty, and again, we just discussed, right? There's different versions of it. It's gradual. It's not black and white. But using hyperscalers and going back to what you see, what from your clients and what you offer to your clients.
I think there are 2 views of it. I think one view is the organizations, the private and commercial organizations within a country, and then the other is the government, right? When we look at what private organizations do, very much to how the others have spoken about it, it's really about risk, intellectual property, and control. So they look at a generic application like email or something like that. There is no organization we talk to, maybe a few public organizations, but the vast majority of commercial organizations, there's nothing, heavily private needed there. On the other hand, if you take their core business process and you say, this is where my intellectual property is created, they want to have protection, right? Either a completely private environment or at least an environment that they can control within the territory. For the government, I think there's 2 choices, right? I think one is, how do I foster a level of national security, but also ecosystem development, talent development, and all of that. And on the other hand, it's like, hey, do I prevent my, kind of private commercial organizations from being able to access the innovation that's available? And I think what we see there is, practical trade-offs, right? Like I look at over the next 5 years, it is inconceivable to me that there will be silicon that's competitive to US silicon today, right? It's maybe over a longer period, but not in the next 5 years. I think if you look at the way that people are working around export controls, there are creative collaboration going on, for example, between some Middle Eastern countries and India, or different parts of Europe. And I think that's the reality. I think it's important that governments keep an eye on the long term, but also don't compromise their own organization's ability, their own commercial organization's ability to compete. And I think you can do both. I think you can be pragmatic and say, hey, for these things, you got to be in full control, and those probably doesn't matter.
I'm curious, George, from you're closest to customers on that type of question. Like we see the US government having to screen or do preliminary checks on new Mythos class models, on the new OpenAI models. Do you think there'll ever be a world in which, like you're saying, enterprises make decisions to own some parts of their data stack, maybe not email? Will there be a world in which the government tells US enterprises, hey, these parts of your business need to be sovereign or need to be data that you own that is not hosted on a cloud that may appear elsewhere?
I think when I look at what's happened with Mythos, for example, it's almost like when you're introducing a pharmaceutical compound, that there is an agency like the FDA that looks at the impact of that and says, yep, that's ready for distribution versus not. I think in this case, it was a bit ad hoc the way it was done. But I think over time, if you look at it and say, hey, this model could be really powerful, but also landed in the wrong hands, could be really damaging. I think there is probably some amount of, kind of self-regulation and government regulation that'll happen. It's just inevitable, I think.
So let's assume for a second that indeed this is a kind of major trend affecting some of the investment decisions, political decisions over the next few years. And let's try to, for a second, to look at the other side of the coin, which is what is the cost of sovereign AI? Because immediately one would think of, potentially building redundant infrastructure, right? And so, but it might be well beyond that. So maybe on this question, maybe Max, I'll ask you to start in terms of from your investor's point of view, in terms of how do you see that financially in terms of the impact it could have? And then maybe, George, I'll ask you to comment on this question.
Yeah, I think financially the simplest answer is it certainly increases the cost. You're building, probably depending on what level of the stack you're deciding needs to be sovereign, you're certainly building duplicate data center infrastructures, you're needing more chips. I think it's kind of a similar dynamic that we're seeing on, hey, if open models continue to grow, do those run as efficiently as some of the closed frontier labs run their inference? Maybe, maybe not. Does that mean there's more semis CapEx that's coming around? I think sovereignty, in at least in some part, implies a level of duplication or replication. That means cost goes up. But maybe if the numbers keep getting bigger, that enforces innovation, like George had been talking about. If the US is spending $1 trillion and we need to duplicate that elsewhere, maybe that means it speeds up the innovation cycle, which is good for everybody.
Exactly. George, you want to comment?
And what's the cost of not having it as well?
Yeah.
To look from the other angle as well.
George, you want to comment on that?
I think you mentioned it exactly right, Max. It depends on what is the outcome, right? I think if the outcome is, hey, there's a lot more innovation created because of constraints usually create innovation, right? It's actually a good thing. It fosters different ecosystems. It brings lower cost models into play. It creates alternate chip designs and all of those things. On the other hand, if it says, hey, I'm going to slow down the adoption of AI because of really complex regulations or no way to use technology across borders, then that's probably not as good a thing. So it really becomes how people play it out. These gentlemen here are examples of new innovation being created because of constraints. So that's a positive thing.
Aaron, you want to comment sorry, mention.
Just maybe to add, I mean, we are building AI factories basically, right? So we built one in Munich, we are building one in Oslo right now. So in order to be competitive, of course, to the hyperscalers, we need to be creative. So I heard the word building blocks a lot here, modular building and so on. So the innovative competitiveness then and creative disruption, as Schumpeter would mention it, is really high now in this field. And to be honest, I don't see much of a premium on sovereign AI compute because there's so much margin in the different layers that you could also decrease then for the end customer. So if you see on the token prices, there's a lot of margin that you could maybe decrease then and still have a profitable case in order to be competitiveness.
I think the most salient point is like what Mahdi said, which is that if we're talking about how governments or nation states think about it, not having it is more salient than like having it, which means that the pricing indicator is that it's inelastic, is in that it doesn't matter how much it costs. And I think that at what point does that stop? No one really knows because it's you know, if the government continues to invest in it, they will continue to invest in it. And I think that that's a confounding factor of like, as you said, Max, like token prices are deflationary, they always will go down, which means you can do more. I mean, it's a great thing. But it's also being deployed in countries that are, like your country is very expensive. And that's, you know, that's by choice. You know, the reason why the first attack on public cloud came from Germany, and the public cloud gave up on it 2 years ago. And it was because people were leaving because of GPUs. And so the underlying technology, Google, Azure, and AWS was fighting everything tooth and nail for over a decade. And then GPUs come out and they're like, all right, we give up, right? And it's at some point, like, people will ask the question, like, should we continue doing it? But then you have another confounding factor of like, what is the value of intelligence? We have abstractions of that, SAT scores, college degrees. College degrees implies that we pay a lot for intelligence, but a lot of people come out of those things are not that intelligent, right? But we'll continue to pay for it. And so the question is like, how do you evaluate if a doctor's good or a lawyer is good? Like we have these very loose, not well-defined, understood but not well-defined, like abstractions of intelligence, because intelligence is unbounded. Just like, at what point is Coatue happy with money, right? Like it's one of those things of like GDP of a country, right? There is no top end, therefore what percentage do you stop? We don't know because we don't have a good way of measuring it. So that's one reason why I think it's really inelastic, is that intelligence itself is not fully measurable or fully understood, but you can see it, right? It has meaning in its visibility, like you can like recognize, but putting a number on that, we have not as a society, global society, have any way of really determining that. And we have even the counterfactual of that, which is like there are VC funds, as Max knows, completely devoted to people who drop out of college. So we have this other side of it, the heterodox side, right? So that's what I'm saying, that like, I think it's just one of those things of like, there will be a bound to it, of course. Like there's something that will not continue this unbounded acceleration. And I think mostly that's kind of like public sentiment, I think, right now. But I do think it's one of those builds of like, it's just one of those things I think that will just keep going because you don't know where it could stop, just like we don't stop researching the universe. Because we don't know where it could go, right?
Exactly. Yeah, no. Okay, I'm checking on the time because there are two more questions I really wanted to get onto. And one, actually, Aaron, I'm going to ask you to start with. It was about, from your point of view, which countries have made most progress on sovereign AI. And I think you and I discussed a pretty interesting example of what you guys have done. So maybe you start, but obviously, Mahdi and Benjamin, I'd love to hear it from you as well. So Aaron.
So like our premier project is with the president of El Salvador, who also owns data centers. And so we did the first Blackwell deployment in LATAM, and we're continuing to build that out. And he's using it both for internal and external purposes. So I think Latin America and South America are actually very strong places for US to take advantage of the comparative cost of deploying theirs cheaper. Like Paraguay is sitting on like 3 gigawatts of just like power there. And so the government actually wants to do something with that. And versus like in Europe, it's scarce, but I do think that, I think France has made not only just statements, but trying to actually move the ball forward. The UK has obviously done a lot with the Starmer there. And Canada has ended up becoming a great place for data centers, and that goes to the cost comparative advantage of like it's just cheaper power there, and it's it's all in the same backbone anyways. But I think the stuff that's happening in Asia, which we have data centers in Asia and we have sovereign projects out there, that's like a different motivation.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's heavily driven by export controls, but that's also the second largest market in the world. People now need to realize that China went from 10% of the top models being Chinese to now it's over 50%. Now the whole pie has grown, right? Where America is about the other 50%, and then China's the other 50%. And that, I think, go-to-market motion will continue, but the build-out in Asia has different motivations than I think Europe and South America, and America are kind of all in the same orbit, and then Asia's kind of doing its own thing.
Okay, Mahdi and Ben, quickly on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at it from the 3 stages that governments are going through, I think we're starting to see movement from the policy to execution. I mean, Radiant is part of Brookfield Asset Management, and as Brookfield, we've made a number of commitments to different European countries to help them achieve sovereignty as well. Recently, $30 billion here in France, in Sweden as well, and a few others that we're basically working on. And I think like once countries start moving towards the execution phase, that's where we'll start to see real sovereignty being achieved within the AI infrastructure space.
Ben?
Yeah, so maybe again from the European perspective, so for obvious reasons, the Nordics are really ahead of building AI factories, right? But I have to emphasize, we had a huge project in Germany. It's 10 megawatts that we have been operational since January. So it's the AI industrial cloud together with Telecom. And you have to imagine that increases the AI compute of Germany by 50%, so 50. Only 10 megawatt. So that's the scale, it's what we are talking about in Europe. So it's a giant leap for Germany, but small step.
So expensive there, dude.
Yes.
So expensive.
Cool. So we're going to run out of time. The last one was about, think about it. 5 years from now, we assume that this theme of sovereign AI is really, keep being increasingly important. How do you see the stack evolving because of this? How is the stack different because of sovereign AI? And maybe, George, I'll ask you to start on that.
I think 5 years is a long time in this industry, but in general, I think the US will still have the full stack chips through models, data, and apps, and of course, operating capabilities. I think that my own view is China will create the other end of the ecosystem, which is, as Aaron mentioned, they have a huge amount of the open source models, and I think they will build a coalition of other nations that want to use those models and contribute to that ecosystem. They have some chips today.
Yeah.
And they have a huge amount of data that the government can marshal, as well as they have big, huge consumer platforms, so they will be viable. I think for the rest of the nations, it's, my own view is it would benefit them to be incredibly practical about what they want to get accomplished. I think they probably need to lean on one of these 2 pillars, borrow certain capabilities from them, innovate, and foster the local ecosystem.
Mahdi?
I think the concept of sovereignty exists for everyone except for the US and China as well. There's no conversation about sovereign AI there because they own that.
Yeah.
So I think for the rest of everyone else, everyone needs to think about, again, the control within that ecosystem. Like as George was mentioning, like the US owns the stack, the US have a stack, China has a stack. So for anyone who wants to achieve sovereignty within that stack, it's all about how you're going to basically build controls.
Control and redundancy.
Yeah, never apologize for America winning. So, I'm very happy about that. So I agree that I think there's two predominant ecosystems being developed. I think chips will be everywhere, models will be everywhere. I think this is going to look a lot like the way the airlines industry works, that in that use case, there's Airbus and Boeing, and then there's some random players. But this is the core too. And I think that will just be prolific. I think every country is going to have some resemblance of their own carrier providers, and they'll be reflective of their own local resources. So, and there'll be ones that have localized winners, like Lufthansa is a winner in Europe, British Airways is a winner, but of course there's all these other like little bitty winners as well. So I think it's going to look much more like airlines, and that's how GPUs and models end up fleshing out.
Ben?
Yes, maybe in Europe in 5 years we will be still heavily dependent on hyperscalers when it comes to infrastructure, also on foreign chips, maybe also on foreign foundation models, right? We have good initiatives. We have on every layer, we have also rising stars in Europe, but there will be still dependency from overseas. But we need to try to attack, need to try to catch up, and we have to come with a gun to the gunfight in the end, not with a knife.
Max, I'll let you conclude.
Yeah, more data centers in more places, thanks to Polarise and lots of other great companies for it.
Excellent. Listen, thank you very much. I think we are definitely out of time. Clearly, massive opportunity for anyone who is actually behind sovereign AI. Ladies and gentlemen, just wanted to thank the 5 panelists. Thank you. Thank you.